In my younger and more impressionable years, I heard a bit of conventional wisdom that I've been carrying in my mind ever since. The book, so it goes, is always better than the movie. I don't happen to agree with that, or even think it's a fair comparison to make, necessarily. A book and a movie are two very different things, after all, but there is at least one instance in which this particular received opinion seems not only reasonable, but irrefutable. Though, maybe I'm only saying that because this particular instance is also my favorite book, The Great Gatsby. The first time I read it was in my late teens, and I loved it right away. I read it again in my late 20s, loved it still, read it again just recently, for the first time in a very long time, and looking at it with fresh eyes, older eyes, hopefully more intelligent and enlightened eyes, though I'm probably flattering myself, I was more aware of its flaws than before. As much as I still adore F. Scott Fitzgerald's prose, there are moments when it feels like he's trying a little too hard, reaching for an eloquence or profundity or poetry that he can't quite grasp. Those moments are very much the exception, but they are present nonetheless. Fitzgerald is not overly kind to his female characters. They're memorably drawn, and Daisy has become something of an icon, embodying the witty but discontented woman of the jazz age, but none of them have much in the way of agency. They function in the story as props for the men, prizes to be won, idols to be adored, losses to be mourned. This shortcoming isn't unique to The Great Gatsby by a long shot, but an unfortunate norm is unfortunate all the same. And the late passage imagining New York as it would have looked to the first Dutch settlers, covered in trees and rich in mystery and wonder, entirely leaves out the native peoples who were already living there. The colonialist perspective is obvious to modern readers, but probably never even occurred to Fitzgerald as he was writing it. Despite that, it, and the few paragraphs that follow it, remain the most breathtaking conclusion to a novel I've ever encountered. So, yeah, it's not perfect, but it's still pretty great. Maybe a little too great, if you've been given the job of adapting it into a movie anyway. The Great Gatsby, the book, has long since entered the canon of American literature and is widely considered one of the best English-language novels of the 20th century. But despite multiple attempts involving some very talented people, none of the movies based on the novel has even approached that level of critical or popular acclaim. To date, there have been at least 7 film or television adaptations of The Great Gatsby. I've seen 4 of them. The other 3 are either lost or not publicly available as of the time I'm making this video. The first is a silent film produced in 1926, the year after the book was first published. It's not a direct adaptation of the book, but rather an adaptation of a stage version that had a successful run on Broadway and on tour earlier in the year. Unfortunately, the 1926 Great Gatsby film is now lost. Only the trailer survives. Contemporary reviews leaned positive, but weren't exactly glowing. F. Scott Fitzgerald hated it. He and his wife Zelda walked out in the middle of the screening they attended, Zelda later writing that it was, quote, rotten and awful and terrible. But you can't go by that. A writer has a very different relationship to their own work than an audience does. Stephen King thinks Stanley Kubrick's film of The Shining is rotten and awful and terrible, but most of the rest of us who've seen it disagree. But, barring some miraculous discovery of a surviving print, when it comes to the 1926 Great Gatsby movie, we'll never have the opportunity to judge for ourselves. And that's a shame. As a fan of the book and of silent cinema, I'd love to see it. Also, fun fact, the actor who plays Nick Carraway in the 1926 version, Neil Hamilton. We know him better for a role he played 40 years later. He's Commissioner Gordon in the 1960s Batman TV series. The next adaptation of Gatsby opened in theaters in the summer of 1949. It's not widely available, but it's findable, and I've seen it. It boasts an impressive cast: Alan Ladd as Gatsby, Betty Field as Daisy, MacDonald Carey as Nick. If you watched Days of Our Lives back in the day, you might remember MacDonald Carey as Tom Horton, or if you watched my Stuffy and Friends Turkey Day video last year, you might recognize him as the off-brand Fred Gailey in the version of Miracle on 34th Street we riffed. Also in the cast are such recognizable faces as Shelley Winters, Ruth Hussey, Ed Begley, Henry Hull, and Elisha Cook Jr. The screenplay was co-written by Richard Maybaum, who would go on to write 13 James Bond movies, and Cyril Hume, who 7 years later wrote the screenplay for a little film called Forbidden Planet. And the film was shot by a brilliant cinematographer, John Seitz, who also worked on Double Indemnity and Sunset Boulevard, among many, many others. Does all that talent add up to a good movie? Not so much. The director, Elliot Nugent, was a journeyman with a lengthy but undistinguished filmography, and he brings nothing to the picture beyond basic competence. The script is also obvious and graceless, tromping from one uninspired scene to the next, filled with leaden dialogue that consists almost entirely of characters declaring their intentions or explaining things to other characters. How much of this is actually the fault of Maybaum and Hume is debatable. They were forced to rewrite their preferred draft after censors declared it in violation of the Hays Code for its depiction of adultery, bootlegging, manslaughter, and various other sins. As a result, the 1949 Gatsby is dull and filled with dreary moralizing, mostly from out of the mouth of poor Nick, who becomes a pious scold on hand to register disapproval and witness comeuppances when they occur. Whereas the book is a beautifully wrought portrayal of the hollowness at the heart of the Roaring Twenties and of the yearning of that generation to recapture the youth and innocence they spent in the First World War, the 1949 film is a thin morality play, dressed up with a faint touch of gangster movie here and soap opera romance there, with a wages of sin lesson delivered about as unskillfully as it could have been without tipping over to become something downright awful. As it stands, the movie is bad, but not downright awful. At least if it were, it might be more interesting. And by the way, I'm saying it's a bad movie because I think it's a bad movie, not because it's different from the book. That's a pet peeve of mine when people reflexively dislike a movie based on a book simply because it isn't slavishly faithful to the source material. An adaptation departing from the original is not a problem for me at all, as long as the adaptation is, good. The 1949 film of The Great Gatsby does suffer greatly in comparison to the novel, but you can, and I think you should, judge it entirely on its own merits and still come to the same conclusion. In a lot of ways, Gatsby 49 is very faithful to the novel. It does make a few significant changes to the plot and to certain characters, but it keeps a hell of a lot too. The story is essentially the same. Gatsby attempts to win back the love of his life, Daisy, who, since they've been apart, has married another man. Gatsby not only wants Daisy to leave her husband for him, but to profess that she never actually loved her husband, but only ever loved Gatsby, which I've always found a bit needy on Gatsby's part. I mean, they've been separated for years. What was she supposed to do? Not move on with her life? When he left, what did he expect? That she was just gonna stand there watching him go like, Jay, come back, Jay. There's like one film nerd cracking the hell up right now. Unfortunately, despite retaining a lot from the novel, one of the things the 1949 film loses is the novel's precisely rendered style. And another is its thoughtful and melancholy attitude toward the events its narrative contains. I don't insist that the film have the same style or the same attitude as the book, but a style and an attitude would be nice. The Great Gatsby was adapted for the screen twice in the 1950s, both on television. In 1955, as an episode of Robert Montgomery Presents on NBC, and in 1958, as an episode of Playhouse 90 on CBS. I haven't seen either one. They aren't publicly available at the moment, though I'd love the chance to watch them. I'm a sucker for the golden age of television, especially the live anthology shows, even if they turned out to be rotten. And I couldn't find much on the Robert Montgomery Presents production, but contemporary reviews for the Playhouse 90 episode were pretty scathing. Just getting to see a kinescope of a live broadcast of The Great Gatsby would be a treat. The next screen version, and the third one made for movie screens, came in 1974, and until 2013, it was the most well-known adaptation. Its screenplay was written by Francis Ford Coppola, his first job after he finished directing The Godfather, and it stars Robert Redford as Gatsby, Mia Farrow as Daisy, Sam Waterston as Nick, Bruce Dern as Tom Buchanan, Karen Black as Myrtle Wilson, plus Edward Herrmann and Vincent Schiavelli running around in there too. It's a hell of a cast. is what I'm telling you. It's not just a great cast on paper either. They do good work here. The three leads, Redford, Farrow, and Waterston, are excellent, especially Waterston. Redford's casting is perhaps a bit too obvious, and he feels just a smidge old for Gatsby, particularly since the age gap between he and Farrow, she's 9 years his junior, is noticeably wider than that of the characters they're playing, but he brings the necessary mixture of hope, idealism, and obliviousness to his own rapidly approaching doom to Gatsby. Mia Farrow does as well with Daisy as anyone ever has. Daisy is a very difficult character, and Farrow renders her as infuriating but irresistible, which is what I think she's meant to be. And Bruce Dern is outstanding as Tom. I had my doubts before watching the movie. Dern is a fine actor, but he just didn't strike me as a Tom Buchanan type. My doubts were misplaced. He makes Tom every bit of the boorish, violent, racist scumbag he is in the novel, and manages to imbue him with some complexity as well. Dern's is the best performance in the film. Despite that cast, and despite its obviously high production value, the movie looks terrific. Gatsby 74 may be the most frustrating of the screen adaptations that I've seen. In the final analysis, it's not a very good movie. It's too long, nearly 2.5 hours, a ludicrously bloated running time for a film adapted from such lean source material. It's repetitive, it's overwrought, but it feels like there's, if not a great movie, at least a good movie in there somewhere. It's always a mistake for a critic to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway. This movie could have been significantly improved with a tighter edit. There's so much fat here just begging to be trimmed. Much of the gratuitous length of the film is devoted to scenes between Gatsby and Daisy, scenes which have no equivalent in the book. The idea, it seems, was to give us more of a sense of their relationship. It's not a terrible idea. In the novel, which is told from Nick's perspective, there aren't that many scenes where Gatsby and Daisy are together, and none where they're together alone. The problem is, the Gatsby and Daisy scenes added to the film are all terrible. We get cornball attempts at classic romance, like an endless scene that transitions from Gatsby and Daisy dancing at his mansion in the present to a flashback of their relationship before the war, and then back to the present where we pick them up still dancing while holding an awkward kiss, and we get scenes that just duplicate later scenes. You can show me that Gatsby is insecure about Daisy's love for him without showing me multiple, nearly identical conversations where Gatsby badgers Daisy to say that she never loved her husband. There's also the foreshadowing of Gatsby's introduction, which is so heavy-handed it's laughable. Shots of Gatsby standing silently in shadow, or shot from behind as he melodramatically reaches out toward the green light at the end of Daisy's dock across the bay. There is some basis in the novel for this. Nick does catch glimpses of a figure who turns out to be Gatsby before they actually meet, but the movie makes Gatsby seem like an ominous mythic figure whose arrival has been prophesied by the ancients, not a vaguely scandalous local rich guy who is the subject of gossip. Gatsby 74 also gives Nick a voiceover narration. Blessedly, it's employed mostly at the beginning and the end, and only sporadically in between, but the film would be better off without it altogether. Lastly, there's the way the film presents one of the novel's least subtle moments. It's after the first party at Gatsby's attended by Daisy, when the sun is coming up and nearly everyone has left. Outside, walking back to the house with Nick, Gatsby is disappointed because he doesn't think Daisy had a good time. Nick tries to reassure him that she enjoyed herself, but Gatsby doesn't believe that. Speaking as much to himself as to Nick, he insists that next time it will be better, that he'll fix it so things between him and Daisy are just like they used to be. Nick scoffs, says to Gatsby, "You can't repeat the past." And Gatsby stares at Nick in disbelief for a moment, then says, "Can't repeat the past." "Why, of course you can." And the moment Gatsby finishes saying that extremely important line, all the exterior lights go out, leaving him standing in darkness, just so we all understand the meaning of that extremely important line. I mean, Jesus. Why not just have Nick turn to camera and tell us the ending at that point? I don't know what's heavier in that scene, the weight of Gatsby's hubris or the weight of that sledgehammer the director is swinging right at our faces. A director swinging a sledgehammer at my face. That reminds me of someone. Well, it'll come to me. The next screen adaptation of The Great Gatsby was produced for television in the year 2000. It stars Toby Stephens as Gatsby, Mira Sorvino as Daisy, and not yet a movie star Paul Rudd as Nick. It premiered in the UK on the BBC and here in the US on A&E. This was during the short-lived prestige TV era of A&E, after it had left behind its original identity as the biography and Nazi documentaries channel, and before it rebranded to its current form as a bottomless pit of reality TV dreck. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, A&E was the home of some of the best original movies and series on cable. It produced or co-produced and aired critically acclaimed, award-winning literary adaptations, including a popular series of films based on the Horatio Hornblower novels, adaptations of Pride and Prejudice, Jane Eyre, Tess of the D'Urbervilles, The Mayor of Casterbridge, Emma, and historical drama miniseries such as Longitude starring Michael Gambon and Jeremy Irons, and Shackleton starring Kenneth Branagh, and the list goes on, and includes The Great Gatsby, which, unlike most of the other movies and miniseries I just mentioned, was not very good. The worst thing I can say about Gatsby 2000 is that it feels unnecessary. It's colorless and lifeless and dull. It feels like a movie nobody asked for, and it does nothing to justify its existence. Most of the time, it plays like a collection of reenactments of scenes from the book that were intended to illustrate a documentary about the novel. The cast tries their best, but there's really nothing they can do. As Gatsby, Toby Stephens is in way over his head. Not one of his old sports is believable, and that's important if you're going to play Gatsby. You need to be able to use the phrase old sport and make it sound like something a human being would ever actually say. Mira Sorvino is an actor with skill and screen presence, but her Daisy isn't any more interesting than the generic scenery that surrounds her. And Paul Rudd does occasionally manage to inject a few fleeting moments of wit into his performance as Nick, but for the most part, he's reduced to standing around and watching and reciting passages from the book to us via voiceover. Just like the creators of the 1974 version, the creators of Gatsby 2000, I love calling it that. It sounds like I'm talking about a futuristic sci-fi reboot where Gatsby lives on the moon. And instead of the green light at the end of the dock, he becomes fixated on the red light in the sky because Daisy lives on Mars. Anyway, the creators of Gatsby 2000 also made the mistake of thinking they needed to give us more Gatsby and Daisy scenes. In this version, those scenes mostly take the form of flashbacks. Gatsby and Daisy's first meeting. Gatsby and Daisy going to a party. The reason those added scenes between Gatsby and Daisy don't work and don't add anything to the story is because we don't need to see what Gatsby and Daisy's relationship was like in the past in order to understand and be invested in the story taking place in the present. The past is a very important factor in the story of The Great Gatsby, but not in a way that requires us to actually see it. Sometimes, quite often in fact, it's better to not show the audience things than it is to overload them with excess stuff. Excess! Baz Luhrmann! That's who I was trying to think of. Baz Luhrmann, the director who has been caving in the skulls of audiences with his films for over 30 years. I am not a fan of Baz Luhrmann. I find his work to be loud, ostentatious, obnoxious, and vulgar in the sense of being tasteless and unsophisticated, not in the sense of being indecent. That second sense of vulgar, I have no problem with. As my luck would have it, Luhrmann directed the most recent screen adaptation of Gatsby. It was released in 2013 and starred Leonardo DiCaprio as Gatsby, Tobey Maguire as Nick, and Carey Mulligan as Daisy. And it's... Okay, so here's something unexpected that happened to me while I was writing this video. I watched all of these movies as a part of my research, obviously. The ones I had seen before, I watched again. The one I had seen most recently before this was the 2013 Baz Luhrmann Gatsby movie. I'm not a fan of Baz Luhrmann at all. Moulin Rouge is one of the worst movies I've ever seen. There's not a moment of it I enjoy. but I remembered thinking his Gatsby movie was not bad, especially compared to the other Gatsby movies, and most especially compared to the rest of Luhrmann's flagrantly phony and fetid filmography. So, as I was thinking about this video and the direction it was going, I had this idea in my mind that when I got to this part, I would be saying that the Baz Luhrmann Great Gatsby, while exhibiting the same shortcomings which are typical of all of Luhrmann's work, is actually the best screen adaptation of the novel to date. But then I watched the movie again, and it was a lot worse than I remembered it. For years, like ever since I watched it for the first time, not long after it came out in 2013, I've been saying, yeah, once Baz Luhrmann gets all his hyperactive bullshit out of his system and settles down, and the movie actually starts to feel like something that was made by a grown-up who's halfway interested in telling a story, it's not bad. I sat down to watch the movie again recently with this in mind, and I waited for that settling down to occur, and it never did. I thought for sure the turning point would be after this shot, the official introduction of Gatsby himself, when Nick realizes the man he's been talking to at the party is, in fact, the man who invited him, his mysterious wealthy neighbor. After what feels like an eternity of camera tricks, fancy transitions, gratuitous slow-mo, gratuitous fast-mo, rapid-fire editing, and so on, surely this shot of Gatsby raising a glass of champagne while literal fucking fireworks go off behind him is the moment when Baz Luhrmann busts a nut, and then we can enjoy the rest of the movie while he rolls over and goes to sleep. But no. Contrary to my memory, the movie just goes on like this. There are lulls here and there, specific scenes or fragments of scenes where the film's obnoxiously excessive qualities calm down enough for it to actually work, but they never last very long. And there's a framing device that I completely forgot about. The story is told to us by Nick, who is a patient in a sanitarium as a result of alcoholism brought on by his association with Gatsby, Daisy, Tom, and all of that. First, Nick tells the story to his doctor. Then, on the doctor's advice, he begins to write it down. And I probably don't need to tell you that what Nick writes turns out to be the novel, or in this movie, I guess, the memoir, The Great Gatsby. The frame story accomplishes nothing other than making the narrative more complicated and creating a clumsy, obvious, and unnecessary parallel between the character of Nick and F. Scott Fitzgerald, who also struggled with alcoholism and was even hospitalized for it at one point. Those fleeting, all-too-brief intervals of lucidity aside, the movie contains everything that makes Luhrmann's work so insufferable. I can't think of another successful mainstream director who places himself between his story and his audience as insistently as he does. Show-offy insecurity radiates from every frame. It would be wrong to say that Luhrmann cares nothing for his story or his characters because he clearly has some interest in, or at least awareness of them, but he clearly cares less about telling the story of the film and more about making sure we never forget for 1 second that it's him who is telling it to us. A simple, well-composed shot will never do when there's an elaborate, digitally assisted, rushing, sweeping, swooping camera move that could be done instead. Subtlety and elegance and restraint are non-existent qualities, for these are not the tools of the carnival barker or the medicine show huckster, whose unctuous techniques Luhrmann has admiringly adapted and adopted as his own. Why whisper when you can shout? Why suggest or imply when you can emphatically declare? Luhrmann's too much is never enough approach even manages to ruin bits that this movie comes closer to getting right than other Gatsby adaptations. One of the more famous moments from the novel comes when Gatsby and Daisy meet again for the first time during the afternoon tea at Nick's place, which Gatsby has engineered. Standing nervously at the mantel of Nick's fireplace, Gatsby accidentally knocks over a clock, which he manages to catch and put back in its place. It's both an amusing, humanizing moment that shows us how anxious Gatsby is about seeing Daisy again after all these years, and a thunderous instance of symbolism related to one of the major themes in the novel. Perhaps because its symbolism is so obvious, or because Fitzgerald's description of how Gatsby manages to fumble the clock isn't clear enough to suggest how it should be staged, Luhrmann's film is the only screen adaptation that even attempts this bit. The other Gatsby films just leave it out entirely. And not only does Luhrmann's film include the clock fumble, it pulls it off very well. In the novel, the clock topples as a result of Gatsby leaning his head against it. That's kind of hard to picture. So, in the film, Gatsby is standing with his elbow resting on the mantel and knocks the clock off when he turns to the side. It plays like something that could actually happen. It feels totally uncontrived. It works fantastically. And then it keeps going. Instead of catching the clock, putting it back, apologizing, and trying to forget about it, Gatsby catches the clock, realizes he's knocked a piece of it loose, frantically tries to fix it, assures Nick he'll have it repaired, tries to fix it some more, then finally sits down and apologizes. Instead of a simple, well-done piece of business that could have spoken for itself, we get an endlessly drawn-out and overdone bit that in reality lasts less than a minute, but feels like it takes forever. Because even when he's not being over the top, Baz Luhrmann can't help but go over the top. He needs to make sure we all notice how nervous Gatsby is and how futile Gatsby's attempts to repair the clock are. God forbid the audience be given any space at all to figure out the significance of something on their own. The people I feel the most sorry for are the actors. The cast is full of outstanding actors who are extremely well suited to their characters. Like Robert Redford, Leonardo DiCaprio feels like obvious casting for Gatsby, but he's also the right casting. And his interpretation does owe something to Redford's. They both seem to approach the character in the same way, connect at the same points. Tobey Maguire seems like he'd be a perfect Nick. The same everyman quality that served him so well as Peter Parker makes him the ideal actor to play the point-of-view character who isn't actually the protagonist, the guy who bears witness to the events rather than standing at the center of them. Carey Mulligan brings glamour, vulnerability, and careless superficiality to Daisy. The supporting cast is likewise stacked, especially Joel Edgerton as Tom, Jason Clarke as George Wilson, and Elizabeth Debicki as Jordan Baker. But what good is a cast that impressive when they've all obviously been directed to play their roles in such a way as to prevent them from giving good performances? With the exception of the star, DiCaprio, who seems determined to invest Gatsby with some actual humanity and mostly succeeds, everyone else is so mannered, so stilted, so broadly theatrical that for most of the film, it feels like Luhrmann's intention is to mock these characters and this story rather than present them in a way that would allow anyone in the audience to care about them. Am I supposed to be invested in these people and what happens to them? Or am I supposed to think they and the world they inhabit is ridiculous and shake my head at the whole thing? Because it would be tough for a great filmmaker to succeed at both. And most of the time, Baz Luhrmann is not even a good one. I can understand why he was attracted to the material, though. If there's a filmmaker anywhere in the world who is as obsessed with appearances, insecure, and desperate to impress as Jay Gatsby, it's Baz Luhrmann. By this point, you may have noticed that the title of this video is, strictly speaking, somewhat inaccurate. Clearly, The Great Gatsby is not unfilmable because it has been filmed or staged for live television broadcast at least 7 times, and I've just spent, let's call it a few minutes discussing what I think are the strengths and shortcomings of the 4 of those 7 productions I've actually seen. The Great Gatsby is filmable. It has been filmed over and over again, and some of the most prominent actors, directors, screenwriters, and other cinematic artists of their generations have taken part in those projects, and yet none of those projects is all that great. So, what's so hard about this? What is it about The Great Gatsby that has made a good film adaptation so elusive? Now that I've recently watched several different adaptations made by different artists in different eras in sometimes wildly different styles, I think it can be explained by 2 primary factors. See, each Gatsby film I watched fails in ways that are unique to itself, among Gatsby adaptations anyway, but there are also certain mistakes that most of them have in common with each other. The first of those 2 factors, the first common mistake, is trying to get the text onto the screen. And I don't mean by adapting the events of the novel into a dramatic presentation on film. I mean literally trying to get the prose itself into the movie. I'm not unsympathetic. I love The Great Gatsby, and one of the things I love the most about it is Fitzgerald's prose. I know I mentioned this at the start of the video. Honestly, among lovers of Gatsby, it hardly even bears mentioning. The prose is so revered that it really goes without saying. It's like saying your favorite part of going to the movies is the popcorn. Oh, really? Haven't heard that one before. Fitzgerald's prose in Gatsby is so exquisite that I understand why a filmmaker adapting the book would want to try to incorporate it. Remember that passage I referenced back at the start, the one that's somewhat problematic for the way it treats the colonialist perspective as the default? Here's what that passage actually says. And this is Nick, having returned to Gatsby's house one last time before leaving New York, lying down on the beach, reflecting. Most of the big shore places were closed now, and there were hardly any lights except the shadowy, moving glow of a ferry boat across the Sound. As the moon rose higher, the inessential houses began to melt away, until gradually I became aware of the old island here that flowered once for Dutch sailors' eyes, a fresh green breast of the New World. Its vanished trees, the trees that had made way for Gatsby's house, had once pandered in whispers to the last and greatest of all human dreams. For a transitory, enchanted moment, man must have held his breath in the presence of this continent. Compelled into an aesthetic contemplation he neither understood nor desired, face to face for the last time in history with something commensurate to his capacity for wonder. And as I sat there brooding on the old unknown world, I thought of Gatsby's wonder when he first picked out the green light at the end of Daisy's dock. He had come a long way to this blue lawn, and his dream must have seemed so close that he could hardly fail to grasp it. He did not know that it was already behind him, somewhere back in that vast obscurity beyond the city, where the dark fields of the Republic rolled on under the night. Your mileage may vary, of course. I know people whose opinions I respect a great deal who find that passage and the novel overall to be overwritten and overwrought, but I find the book and that passage and the conclusion that follows it to be some of the most beautiful writing I've ever encountered. Of course, if I were facing the task of making a film out of The Great Gatsby, I would be tempted to try and take what I just read and put it on the screen. There are ways to do it. You can literally put the text on screen in the form of titles. Baz Luhrmann does a bit of that in his version. Once Nick begins writing the account of his experience with Gatsby in the frame story, we occasionally see what he's writing or typing, and Luhrmann can't resist the urge to put the novel's famous final lines on screen, superimposed over the lapping waves of the bay, which feels a little like overkill, considering that the lines employ the metaphor of being in a boat and rowing against the current. But then again, as I hope I've already made clear, overkill is Baz Luhrmann's middle name. Actually, Baz Luhrmann probably has like 24 middle names, of which Overkill is merely the last one, because he wanted to make sure everyone got it. This video has turned into a work of Baz Luhrmann slander, and I am absolutely fine with it. Luhrmann also uses voiceover to get Fitzgerald's prose from the page into the film. In fact, most of the Gatsby films I watched do that. It's an obvious enough decision. Voiceover narration is an established technique, a familiar part of the language of cinema, and the novel is written in first person, so why not have Nick be the narrator and tell us the story using his words from the novel? The problem is, there are many, many memorable passages from the novel, and voiceover is a technique which is best used very sparingly, if at all. Nick narrates the story in the book because it's a book, and without Nick's narration, there would be no story at all. With a movie, though, we don't need a character to verbally tell us what's happening. We can see it. We can hear characters speak for themselves in the moment. Voiceover narration can be an effective part of a film, but all too often it's either redundant or serves only to render a film flat and literal. In most of the Gatsby films, Nick's narration only serves to reinforce what we're watching on the screen. It's superfluous. We don't need Nick to tell us about Gatsby's party. We're watching the party happen right now. We don't need Nick to tell us what a given interaction between Daisy and Gatsby means, or what Tom's reaction to it is, or how Gatsby or Daisy or Nick himself feels about something. Those are things we should be able to tell from the performances of the actors and from the less overt elements of cinematic storytelling, the position and angle of the camera, the editing, the music, the use of sound and silence. The reason there's so much voiceover narration in the Gatsby films isn't because it's necessary to tell the story. It's because the book is beautifully written and the filmmaker wanted to put that writing in their movie. But movies and books are very different media. I love The Great Gatsby, the book, but when I watch The Great Gatsby, the movie, I want to watch a movie, not listen to someone read the book to me. Of the 4 films I watched, the only one that doesn't fall into the trap of overusing voiceover is the earliest one, Gatsby 49. It's also the one that takes the most liberties with the novel, albeit not for the best of reasons and not with the best results. Nonetheless, that willingness to depart from the original text makes Gatsby 49 an exception to the second factor in the failure of the Gatsby adaptations, the second common mistake, an overly reverent view of the source material. The most striking difference between Gatsby 49 and the other 3 versions I watched is in how modestly it treats the story. The work of F. Scott Fitzgerald was not greatly appreciated by the public in his lifetime. His books were well reviewed and he was respected as a writer, but he never achieved lasting commercial success, nor was he hailed as a once-in-a-generation genius. It wasn't until after Fitzgerald died in 1940 that his work was reevaluated and began to attract greater appreciation. What really boosted the popularity of Gatsby in particular was World War II. The Great Gatsby was one of more than 1,300 books published in an armed services edition and sent to American troops deployed overseas. 150,000 armed services editions of the book were distributed, which was more than 6 times the total number of copies published in the United States since the book was first published in 1925. It's easy to imagine why the book was so popular with the troops. Both Nick and Gatsby are veterans of the First World War, and Gatsby's all-consuming goal is to realize the idealized life he imagined for himself before the war. I can see why that would appeal to soldiers in World War II, stationed far from home. Anyway, all of that is to say that when the 1949 Gatsby film was made, that Fitzgerald revival was still in its early days. By the time the 1974 version went into production, The Great Gatsby had exploded from a well-reviewed book receiving some belated recognition into the great American novel. Now it was The Great Gatsby. Consequently, any film adapted from it needed to be, well, great, epic, opulent, impressive, a towering work of cinema worthy of the stature of this timeless masterpiece. Except, The Great Gatsby is a fairly modest volume. The first edition is less than 220 pages. This edition I read from a few minutes ago is only 174 pages. The print is fiendishly tiny. The story itself is pretty straightforward. Yes, it's loaded with theme and symbolism. Yes, it has a lot to say about the Jazz Age and post-World War I America and class and the shallowness and cruelty and hypocrisy of the rich and numerous other subjects. It's a rich text that supports an endless variety of interpretations, but the scope of the story itself is narrow, limited to the lives of maybe half a dozen people in a pair of little villages on Long Island. Part of what makes the novel so powerful is how compact it is. Fitzgerald's writing is elegant and efficient. Some might criticize him, not unfairly, for being a bit florid with his language, but he's not a gas bag. The Great Gatsby is a lean book and a fast read. Find yourself a few free hours in a row some afternoon and you can read the whole thing in one sitting. Why, then, are 2 of the 3 most recent screen adaptations so damn long? Gatsby 74 runs nearly 2.5 hours, and Gatsby 2013 is only a few minutes shorter than that. Gatsby 2000 was produced to run 2 hours for commercial television, so without commercials, it's a nice trim 90 minutes, but as I have already discussed, it has other problems, mainly the fact that it is not a sci-fi version that ends with Nick musing poetically about how the Sea of Tranquility must have looked to the first astronauts who landed there, but I digress. Did the producers of the 74 and 2013 Gatsby films believe a 90-minute movie would be too meager for an adaptation of such a monumental book? If so, they made the mistake of trying to adapt the novel's reputation rather than the novel itself. Both Gatsby 74 and Gatsby 2013 seem preoccupied with putting across how important this story is. As a result, Gatsby 74 is ponderous and precious, and Gatsby 2013 is way too much of everything. The novel doesn't have any of that baggage. Fitzgerald may sometimes try too hard to convince us of his merits as a prose stylist, but he doesn't break a sweat trying to sell us on how capital I important his story is. He just tells the story. That's something that doesn't seem to have occurred to Jack Clayton, director of Gatsby 74, Robert Markowitz, director of Gatsby 2000, or Baz Luhrmann, director of, well, just tell the story. Forget how important the book is. Forget that it's a revered classic. Leave all those expectations outside the soundstage door and focus on the story. Who are the characters? What do they want? What's it all about? What is its essence? And how do you translate that essence from something that works in a novel to something that works on a screen? It seems to me that the first thing you would have to do is rid yourself of the reverence for the original text. Treat it like source material, not sacred scripture. Be willing to cut stuff out, to add things, to change things. Instead of porting over Fitzgerald's actual words in the form of voiceover or on-screen titles, find ways of evoking them visually. Create cinematic moments that echo the elegance and beauty and poignancy that Fitzgerald creates on the page. A movie can do everything a work of literature can do, but not in the same way. Use the language of film the same way Fitzgerald used prose. That's easier said than done. Particularly coming from me, who has directed exactly 0 films and has never attempted to even write the script for a screen adaptation of Gatsby, much less tried to actually produce it. But just because I couldn't do it doesn't mean somebody else couldn't. We haven't seen the last movie or TV version of The Great Gatsby. Undoubtedly, there will be others in years to come. Since the novel has now been in the public domain for several years, I'm a little surprised we haven't seen one yet. Maybe the next one will also be underwhelming. Maybe the next 2 or 3 will be. Maybe I won't live to see a good one at all. But even if it never happens, it will always be possible. Until it does, there will still be those who say, you can't make a good film from The Great Gatsby. And there will also be those of us who answer that by saying, can't make a good film from The Great Gatsby? Why, of course you can. It might just be an article of faith. Something for some of us Gatsby lovers to believe in, like Gatsby believed in the green light at the end of Daisy's dock. A good Gatsby film has eluded us so far, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will write better, open our minds wider, and one fine day, so we beat on. Boats against the current. Borne back, well,